Hey everybody, how are you doing today? We are going to now dive into chapter 6, which is about perception. Um, I know that all of you have completed the second quiz. Congratulations. And we're going to do some more talking about kids, infants, and how we develop. Fascinating subject, right? Where we are in chapter 6 is talking about different types of perception. And I want to make it clear that there is a differentiation in the two words sensation and perception. And it's an important difference that I think warrants having a slide about it. So if you look at the definition for sensation, it's detecting a stimulus through the various senses. Taste, a sense of touch, a sense of vision, a sense of hearing, etc. There are stimulus that come into our auras, so to speak, into our senses that are really important. So as infants develop, those types of things develop with them as they discover the world. Perception is nuanced, different, but it's the way that we make sense of our sensations. All right. So think about that infant at birth, what their perception of the world is, and what their perceptual abilities are. What are the experiences required to develop perceptual abilities? And think about what the relation is as we go back to all the time in this course is about nature versus nurture. So take a look at this classic point of view. Stare at it for a minute. What do you see? It's black and it's white. They're two colors. So your senses are taking in a visual of the black and white. Your perceptual abilities may be telling you one thing or another. What are the images that come to your brain? Here's another one. Again, stop and take a moment to look. Our senses are taking in visual information, right? Translating that into our brain. Do you see a three-pronged object? Or are you being deceived? Last one, get you thinking. Do you see a beautiful young woman? Or do you see an old storybook style witch? Thinking about it, I see both. But you have to shift your perception of what your senses are telling you. Last one, again, classic. In some respects, right, these contrasting views suggest that infants are equipped with somewhat sophisticated abilities, allowing them to make sense of the world. It's important to understand the relationship between perception and action. Again, think about a child who has typical motor activity. It allows them to be mobile around the world that they live in and learn about the different stimulation points, whether it's visual, auditory, touch. Those things allow them to develop perceptually and in thus regards, right, learn about the world. As our perceptual skill develops as we get older, so do motor skills. And each are really inexplicably and intrinsically linked. When you have children who have different visual processing, for example, or who visually do not take in the world, how does that alter their ability to be able to develop this perception of the world? And we'll talk about that as we go along, especially next week. So some of the things that are important for us as educators as well as non-educators is to think about the theories of perceptual development. And theories, as you know, are pervasive in education and psychology. The one I want you to sort of hone in on right now is the nativist theory. And it's the fact that out there are perceptual structures exist independently of how they're perceived, right? And that our perceptual systems have evolved over time to pick up information that's available. It's called the theory of direct perception, and I make sure that you take the time to really learn some of that that's outlined in the book. So if you think about it, in this picture, you have a baby who's hanging on, grabbing, exploring this cluster of grapes. And by exploring through all sorts of senses, grasping, squeezing, tasting, babies then learn about the quality of grapes, and including that they are good to eat, right? Because they're of the taste. Another theory that we talk about in education, excuse me, I'm just shifting, is the constructionist theory. It's how we interpret the physical world is not necessarily constrained by the nature of our perceptive systems. In other words, we gain information through different transactions in the environment that might influence our perception. And those influences are often a result of prior knowledge that helps us navigate the world in an environment in order to interpret different experiences. And the key theorist on this is really Piaget. So how do you look at how perceptual development is studied, right, in infants? And it's fascinating because you think about how infants are not necessarily creatures that stay put. Researchers look at what's called preferential looking time or techniques, right? It assists in determining what kind of stimulus can be distinguished. It presumes that if the infant prefers one thing or another, that they can perceive a difference between the two. Researchers typically look at rate, how often infants gaze at something, what's the duration of that gaze, or maybe even in the intensity of that gaze. So they use that data to inform how infants create perceptual preferences. Through something called habituation studies, it's a concept of boredom and novelty. And I think many of us suffer from if the environment around us is boring, same, right? We tend to seek out new and novel things. So in some respects, once an item becomes familiar, the novelty wears off and boredom sets in, and less attention is paid to it because of the habituated, it's called habituated to the display in research. Individuals are designed, we as people are designed to look and attend to new things, or see things that are new and exciting and novel. In other words, it's somewhat of a release from habituation. It allows us to continue to be, for lack of a better word, curious. These kinds of studies have their limitations in the fact that infants might be able to determine between the two stimuli, right? If they're presented between two things or two toys or two smells or two tastes, but they don't necessarily show preferences when they're really young. And maybe with that, the stimulation discrimination might not be detected. So as we develop, right, our senses develop. So we're going to talk a little bit as we go forward about the senses, the five senses. So if you think about development of touch, the sense organ that facilitates touch is the skin. And the skin is a very large sense organ. We have nerve endings that respond to temperature and all sorts of other dimension. Go back and think about the different types of checks that are done with infants as they develop. There's a rooting reflex. Then when you touch their cheek, right, they seek out, you can see them, that they react to that touch. It's called the rooting reflex. What did we say is important about that is literally survival, is to find that mother's milk. Babinski's reflex is when you touch the bottom of their feet and their toes splay out, right? They feel that touch. Somewhere around 1 year, infants begin to really discriminate objects based solely on touch. And what's interesting, if you really watch children investigate the world, infants investigate the world, is that they not only touch with their hands, but they also tend to touch with their mouths. Kids put their things in their mouth all the time, and it's their way of getting to know the various objects in the world. There have been recently studies about newborns and their sensitivity to taste. It's sort of been found that by reaction, newborns appear to prefer sweet, and that the four tastes, sweet, sour, bitter, and salt, produce a change in facial expressions in 2-hour-old infants. The early researchers used the concept of how do I put this? The speed of sucking with sweeter fluid. In other words, if there was a sweeter fluid, there were fewer pauses in the infant sucking behavior. So that became the notion of identifying it as a preference. And taste preferences can be modified through early experience, right? So depending on what you're feeding your infant, you can have them develop a taste preference early on. Smell is an interesting sense because remember, part of what that reaction is, it's connected to social interaction, and it helps with identification. Smell also protects us from toxic substances that smell, quote, foul, unquote. And odor preferences can also be learned. So that continues into adulthood. Hearing is a sense that's extraordinarily well developed at birth. And auditory sensitivity improves through infancy and reaches its peak at about school age. Most of the sounds that hearing is sensitive to is that of the human voice, that within the range of the human voice. And we are also very well attuned to musical sounds. In very, very young infants, even a few days old, they can distinguish patterns of tone, of rising or descending. And by 6 months, they can discriminate between simple melodic patterns. Excuse me. Think of nursery rhymes. Pardon me. The development of vision is probably at birth the least developed of all the senses. When you're born, actually, your retina is not fully mature. So there is a quality of vision that is fine-tuned as infants grow. And by about 8 months, they can see about 25% as well as adults. So visual acuity is not there at birth, and it reaches the adulthood stage by about 5 years old. Also, visual accommodation, in other words, how our lenses change to look at objects close and far away, it's beginning to, at 2 to 4 months, beginning to achieve adult levels of accommodation. So think about changing, when you change your vision from reading to looking at distance, how your lens, the shape of your lens, eye lens, has to accommodate for that. So one of the things that we find, I think probably in the last 50 years or so, is that the cones in the eye are the cells that produce color, and they're not fully developed at birth. Again, the retina itself is not fully developed at birth. And newborns don't perceive color, which is why it was interesting for a while with the trend away from different types of toys that were colorful until a baby was maybe somewhere around 3 or 4 months old. So you see a lot of trend with black and white types of images for very young children. By around 2 months, that discrimination of colors starts to complete itself across the spectrum. And by 4 months, we perceive colors as adults would. So other types of keys to vision, and again, all of this information in terms of the senses is directly connected to what we'll be talking about in terms of when children do not have the ability to see or hear or be mobile. With other vision, there are things like patterns. Newborns prefer to look at pattern stimulants rather than plain. I was with a friend's newborn not that long ago, and it was so interesting to watch this baby really focus in on a very loud plaid green and black shirt that someone else was wearing close to us. So there's a contrast sensitivity there, right? Object perception, it depends on the size and the shape and the consistency. And young infants can distinguish objects from the surroundings by relying really kind of on motion. Facial perception, infants prefer the schematic illusions of faces. In other words, if you put a face pattern up as opposed to an abstract pattern, the preference for an infant will be face. Think about survival. Why do infants come with almost that hardwired in at birth? By about 3 months, infants have clear preferences to looking at the human face image. And again, it's survival. Who are the people who are going to protect me? So this is a visual called a visual cliff. And from about 6 months, infants can develop depth and an understanding to determine their well-being, right? In other words, there are a set of cues that are both kinesthetic, touch, and pictorial. If you look at this platform, that infants know what they're looking at will be a danger to them, right? If you step off the cliff. I think the takeaways from this chapter, and again, I know that there's a lot more information that you need to read in the book, is that the perceptual abilities are really very well developed in infancy. And it's something I don't think that we always take into account as adults. The field still is not resolved. And again, there's ongoing research in terms of whether our perceptual abilities are innate or learned. And that research just continues to go on. The takeaway really is to think about this chapter in the perspective of the relevance to a child's cognitive and social development as they explore the world, as they understand the world. How can they grow in experience and take in that information? And what are the consequences for those children who do not have all of those abilities? So until we meet again, I'm going to stop, and we'll go on to the next piece at your leisure.